Marcus Shaw, a successful black CEO, faces relentless racial prejudice during a visit to a small-town diner. Despite his wealth and status, he is subjected to mocking glances, insults, and assumptions from a group of diners and Officer Daniels, a corrupt, bigoted cop. Daniels tries to belittle Marcus, insisting that people like him don't belong in places of privilege. As the tension escalates, Marcus must confront the deep-seated racism and systemic injustice in a town that refuses to see him as anything more than an outsider, despite his achievements and humanity. The sun had barely begun its descent when Marcus Shaw stepped into the small diner on the corner of First and Main. It was a quiet place, tucked between a hardware store and an old bookshop, where the smell of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee filled the air. The floors creaked underfoot, the walls adorned with faded photographs from a time long past, and the windows were framed by heavy red curtains that were always drawn tight, the kind of place where the patrons all knew each other's names, and where a stranger like Marcus didn't quite belong. He pushed the door open with the soft chime of a bell overhead. The low murmur of conversation dropped for a second, before slowly rising again, almost as if the room had exhaled in relief at his arrival. He didn't expect much attention. It was the middle of the afternoon, the lunch rush long gone, and the place was sparsely populated with a few regulars seated at the counter. A man with a weathered face and a baseball cap, a mother and daughter huddled over a half-eaten sandwich, and a couple of older women, their voices too soft to decipher, were the only ones in the room. To them, Marcus was just another customer, but to the waitress behind the counter, the one in her 50s, wearing a plain blue uniform and a name tag that read, Diane, Marcus stood out. Not just because of the expensive suit that fit him like it had been tailored by the finest hands, not because of the watch gleaming subtly on his wrist, its polished steel catching the light in such a way that it could make someone question their own sense of style. It wasn't even the way he carried himself, with an unspoken authority that had been cultivated over years in boardrooms and courtrooms, both figuratively and literally. It was the fact that, despite all of this, despite everything that his outward appearance said, Marcus Shaw was a man who, by all accounts, should not have walked into this diner. Not in the way he did, not with the simple ease of someone unbothered by the fact that he was out of place. "How can I help you, sir?" Diane's voice was a blend of polite curiosity and something else, something that had been ingrained into the fabric of small-town service for too long. She had no idea who Marcus was, but she knew enough about how things worked around here to assume he was just passing through. Perhaps he was some big-shot businessman, just another rich man who would step in for a quick bite, throw a tip that was a little too generous, and leave before anyone had a chance to speak. He was certainly the kind who would have no problem with that. Marcus smiled at her, his warm, easy grin that never seemed to fade. "I'll take a cup of coffee," he said, his voice smooth with the calm certainty that came from years of knowing exactly what he wanted. "And whatever your special is, thanks." Diane hesitated for a moment, glancing down at the menu as if she needed to check the options once more. She didn't. She already knew that the special would be a roast beef sandwich with a side of coleslaw. It was simple, nothing extraordinary, but Marcus didn't mind that he didn't come here for the food. As he slid into a booth by the window, overlooking the sleepy street outside, he noticed the subtle change in the atmosphere. It was the way the regulars, those who had been here since the early morning, now seemed to avoid looking his way. It wasn't obvious, not overt, nothing so crude as staring, but it was there. The slight shift in posture, the lowered gaze, the change in pitch when someone spoke too loudly. Marcus was used to it. He'd lived with it all his life, the feeling of walking into a room where people automatically assumed you didn't belong. He'd worked hard to carve a place for himself in a world that so often wanted to push him aside. At the age of 42, he had built a reputation as one of the most successful black CEOs in the tech industry. His company had revolutionized cybersecurity, making headlines for both its success and its commitment to diversity. And yet, despite his wealth and power, there was still a certain undercurrent to his existence that never quite went unnoticed. The way the world seemed to remind him, every so often, that he was different. It was in the sideways glances he'd caught at corporate functions, the muted surprise when people learned who he was, Marcus Shaw, the man who owned half the city's tech infrastructure, and also, inexplicably, the man who didn't always feel like he fit in, As he stirred his coffee, his thoughts wandered for a moment. This diner, this small slice of nowhere, was miles away from the meetings and galas that typically filled his life. The people here weren't concerned with cybersecurity or algorithms or the next big venture. They were concerned with things that felt simpler, like how their kids were doing in school, or whether the weather would hold for the county fair next week. They had no idea who Marcus was, and in a strange way, that was what he liked about it. But even here, even in this small corner of the world, there was the invisible weight of judgment. He couldn't escape it, no matter where he went. As the coffee filled his cup, he caught the eyes of the man in the baseball cap, a grizzled, older gentleman who had been sitting quietly at the counter. The man looked at him for a moment, his gaze lingering a little too long, before looking away. There was something in the way people reacted to Marcus that never quite made sense to him. He had spent years fighting for respect, for the recognition that his success wasn't a fluke, that his place in the world was earned. And yet, it was as though his skin color and his presence in spaces where people thought he didn't belong were still things that others couldn't quite process. It was an invisible wall he kept encountering. As Diane brought over his meal, a simple sandwich with coleslaw on the side, Marcus thanked her with a genuine smile, appreciating the small gesture. "How's the town been treating you?" he asked, breaking the silence. His voice was kind, soft, inviting her to speak. "Oh, you know," Diane replied with a half-smile. Same old folks around here don't come in much, but when they do, they expect a good meal, and I give it to them." She glanced at the small clock above the counter. "It's a quiet place mostly." Marcus nodded, taking a bite of the sandwich. He could feel the eyes of the man in the baseball cap on him again, watching him with an air of quiet suspicion. It was subtle, but real. Marcus had seen it too many times to be mistaken about it. He could hear the low murmurs of conversation around him, the occasional laughter, the soft scrape of chairs moving as people settled into their seats. But beneath it all, he could feel the divide, the unspoken assumption that he wasn't supposed to be there. It was a feeling he had learned to endure, even when it gnawed at him. This town, this diner, was just another reminder of how far he had come, and how far some people still needed to go. His status, his wealth, his success, could never fully erase the way society treated him. But Marcus had learned not to let it bother him. Not outwardly anyway. His power lay in his silence, his composure. He knew that the way people saw him was rarely a reflection of who he was, and more often than not, he was content to let them have their illusions. His phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him from his thoughts. Marcus glanced at the screen, seeing a series of missed calls and text messages from his assistant, his lawyer, and a few colleagues. There was a board meeting scheduled for later in the week, a potential merger, and some press interviews. The life he had built was always just a few phone calls away, always pulling him back into a world that felt distant and far removed from this moment in the diner. But for now, he simply sat back in his booth, allowing himself a rare moment of peace. The world outside could wait. As he took another sip of his coffee, the door to the diner swung open, and a group of local men stepped inside. They were loud, laughing, their voices carrying through the room. One of them, the youngest, spotted Marcus and gave him a slow, appraising look. There was something about the way the young man scanned Marcus, the way his eyes lingered just a second too long on the suit, the watch, that made Marcus instinctively straighten his posture. It wasn't until one of the men whispered something to the others that the room fell quiet again. The laughter stopped for a moment, replaced by the soft shuffle of feet as the group took their seats a few tables away. Marcus didn't look up immediately, but he felt the change. The tension in the room had shifted, like the prelude to a storm. He could almost hear the words behind the silence, could almost feel the judgment in the air. It wasn't just a glance. It was the way their eyes flicked over him, sizing him up, unsure of where to place him in their neatly organized world. It wasn't about the suit, it wasn't even about the color of his skin. It was about the way he had walked into their world, so seamlessly, as if he had the right to be there. And somehow, that made him more out of place than anything else. Marcus placed his coffee cup down gently, his mind already shifting into a different gear. He was used to this. The questioning looks, the whispers that never quite made it to his ears, the assumption that a man like him didn't belong in places like this. It was all too familiar, too easy to ignore. He was used to being underestimated. But tonight, something told him that this moment, this small diner, was about to remind him of something he hadn't considered in years. His phone buzzed again, this time with a single word. Watch. The message came from his lawyer. He knew what it meant, but for now, Marcus Shaw remained still, his calm gaze meeting the group's eyes across the room, a quiet defiance in his posture as the storm, both in the diner and outside of it, began to brew. Marcus Shaw had never been one to make a scene. He wasn't the kind of man to demand attention or disrupt the status quo. In fact, he preferred the opposite, a quiet, unassuming presence in the world. As a CEO, he had learned the delicate art of moving through life with poise, his sharp intellect often the only weapon he needed to diffuse tense situations, but no amount of restraint could stop what was about to unfold. The group of young men who had entered the diner just moments ago had clearly noticed Marcus. He had felt their eyes on him, their attention shifting in his direction like the quiet hum of an electric current. They had taken him in, the suit, the watch, the unshakable calm with which he carried himself. They had tried to size him up, tried to figure out where he fit into their world. For the first few minutes, Marcus remained silent, content to let the subtle tension in the air go unnoticed by the others. But as the group began to talk among themselves, the low murmurs grew louder. It was clear to him now that they were trying to figure him out, dissecting his appearance, his presence in a place like this. The youngest of the group, a lanky man with a scruffy beard, glanced over at Marcus with a look of mild disbelief, as if he couldn't fathom why a man like him would step into a place like this. The way he eyed Marcus was nothing short of condescending, an invisible line being drawn in the sand that Marcus had long since learned to navigate. It wasn't until the man muttered something under his breath that the tension shifted, becoming undeniable. "I don't get it. What's he doing here?" the young man whispered to the others, just loud enough for Marcus to hear. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't need to. He'd heard it all before. The subtle, well-masked judgments, the assumptions, the unspoken biases that people clung to. It wasn't new. But tonight, something in the air felt different. The hostility, while quiet, had an edge to it, one that Marcus couldn't ignore. One of the older men in the group, a burly fellow with a thick neck and a low, gravelly voice, shifted in his seat. His eyes lingered on Marcus for a moment too long, his gaze slow and calculating. "You sure he can pay for that?" the man asked, his voice laced with suspicion as he glanced toward Marcus's half-eaten meal. His tone tinged with something darker. The comment wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight that Marcus could feel the heat rising in his chest. He had been the target of plenty of jokes and comments in his life. He was well aware of what people thought of him when they saw a black man in a designer suit, his polished shoes gleaming under the diner's fluorescent lights. He had fought tooth and nail to build his life, to show people that he wasn't just a stereotype. But even here, in this quiet diner, the weight of those assumptions pressed in on him. Marcus remained calm, his face a mask of composure. He took a deliberate sip of his coffee, letting the heat of the liquid momentarily settle his nerves. In a world that often wanted to dismiss him, he had learned to let the silence speak louder than any words ever could. But as the minutes ticked by, the whispers continued, rising in volume as the group of men became emboldened by the lack of response. One of them, a middle-aged man with a thick southern drawl, leaned over to his friend at the counter, making sure his voice was loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Wonder if he's one of them tech boys," the man said, his tone dripping with condescension. "I mean, he sure don't belong here with the rest of us." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He had expected something, perhaps a glance, maybe a questioning look, but this felt different. This wasn't just a comment about his appearance, it was about his worth, about whether a man like him had any right to be here. He could feel the familiar sting of injustice rising in his chest. It wasn't just about the assumptions they were making about him as a black man. It was about the way they thought they could define his place in the world without knowing a thing about him. But Marcus held his ground. He wasn't about to let them see him flinch. The eyes of the room were now on him, the group of men at the counter casting glances between him and each other. The quiet had become palpable. Diane, the waitress, noticed it too. Her fingers faltered slightly, as she poured a refill of coffee into Marcus's cup, her gaze darting nervously between him and the group at the counter. It was a small, unspoken acknowledgement of the tension in the air, and Marcus could sense her discomfort. She set the coffee pot down on the counter, her voice low when she spoke. "Everything all right, sir?" Marcus looked up at her with a polite smile. "Everything's fine," he replied evenly. His voice didn't betray the simmering frustration in his chest, though it was becoming harder to suppress. He had been trained in professionalism his entire life. He knew how to control his emotions, how to remain steady under pressure. But this subtle, insidious form of prejudice was beginning to gnaw at him. He had worked so hard to get to where he was, to earn his place in a world that wasn't made for people like him. He had proven himself time and again. He had built a successful tech empire, had become a respected leader in his field, and yet, here he was, treated like an outsider in a quiet diner, a man whose accomplishments were reduced to the assumptions others made about him. As the tension mounted, Marcus felt something deep within him stir: anger. A quiet, simmering anger that he had learned to bury long ago. It wasn't just about this moment. It was about a lifetime of moments like this. It was about every time he had been underestimated, every time he had been told that he didn't belong, but he couldn't let it show. Not here, not now. Instead, he chose to remain calm, his expression neutral as he turned his attention back to the sandwich in front of him. The bite of roast beef tasted bland now, an echo of everything he had fought to achieve. It was the taste of quiet frustration, of systemic injustice that could never be completely erased. And yet, as he took another bite, Marcus realized something: the moment had changed. The group of men, the ones who had been mocking him just moments ago, were now silent. Their laughter had faded, replaced by an awkward quiet that hung in the air. It was almost as if they were waiting for something, for a sign that Marcus would react, that he would stand up and call them out for what they had said. But Marcus Shaw didn't react, not the way they expected. He continued to eat his sandwich, his movements slow and deliberate, his gaze fixed on the window. The city beyond, full of movement and life, seemed a world away from this tiny diner, from the judgments being passed in hushed tones and sideways glances. And that was when the man with the baseball cap spoke up again, his voice carrying across the room. "Something wrong with this picture," he muttered, barely audible but enough to reach Marcus's ears. "He doesn't look like he's from around here, but he sure does carry himself like he belongs." Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't allow himself to react. Instead, he stood slowly, sliding out of the booth with the smooth, practiced grace that came with years of navigating these moments. He pulled his jacket tighter around him as he made his way to the counter, where Diane was still standing. She glanced up at him, her expression a mixture of relief and something else. Maybe guilt. Maybe unease. She couldn't be sure what had happened. She couldn't be sure if Marcus had noticed the way the men had been talking about him, but he had. And now, he was about to do something that would change the course of this interaction. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady. "Okay, I'd like to pay for everyone's meal here today." Diane blinked, momentarily taken aback. The men at the counter were staring at him now, their expressions ranging from confusion to discomfort. It was clear that they weren't sure how to respond, how to react to a man who wasn't just a passerby in a suit. He was someone who had decided to take control of the situation, to turn the tables in a way they hadn't expected. But Marcus didn't care. He didn't need their validation. "I'll take care of it," he repeated. Marcus Shaw had thought he could escape the ever-watchful eyes for just a moment. A brief, stolen hour in a small diner away from the pressure, away from the spotlight. But as the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room became unbearable, thick as molasses, pulling him down like a lead weight. He could feel the eyes of the men at the counter, their silent judgment weighing down on him as if he were a spectacle, a curiosity, something to gawk at and dissect. The quiet murmurs from earlier had grown into something far more insidious. Every movement he made, the way he lifted his cup to his lips, the way his fork touched the plate, seemed to be under scrutiny. And then came the insult that Marcus had known was coming, but hadn't fully prepared for. "You know," the burly man with the thick neck said, leaning forward, his voice lowering to a mocking whisper, I bet you don't even know the first thing about working for a living." Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't look up from his meal. But that comment, the casual cruelty wrapped in a veneer of supposed familiarity, hit him harder than he had anticipated. It wasn't just the fact that the man had assumed he was entitled, that his wealth meant he didn't deserve to be here. It was the way the room seemed to condone it. The others around him, the regulars, were too used to this kind of behavior to react. Diane, the waitress, looked away, her eyes darting nervously between Marcus and the men, unwilling to make a move. The young man who had whispered earlier, the one with the scruffy beard, smirked, no longer even bothering to hide his amusement. And then, just as Marcus was about to let the moment pass, something shifted. The door to the diner swung open with a loud jingle, and in walked 2 police officers. The room fell silent. A ripple of unease passed through the patrons, their eyes shifting toward the officers as if they were in a movie, waiting for the next scene to unfold. Marcus felt the tension immediately. His shoulders tensed and his fingers gripped the edge of the table. The officers weren't just any law enforcement. No, these 2 had made their presence known in this town for years. And they weren't here to make anyone feel welcome. One of them, a man who must have been in his mid-50s, looked at Marcus and paused. There was no overt aggression in his gaze, but there didn't need to be. His look was enough. It was a look that said, "You don't belong here." He was Officer Daniels, a man whose reputation for prejudice had preceded him. The second officer, younger, looked uncomfortable, but it was clear he was following Daniels' lead. Without saying a word, Daniels glanced over at the group of men at the counter, giving them a slight nod. That small gesture, that slight acknowledgement, made Marcus's blood run cold. It wasn't a simple acknowledgement of authority, it was a signal that this wasn't just a random encounter. No, this was something more. Something far more dangerous. "Hey, are you lost?" Officer Daniels' voice broke the silence, his eyes narrowing as they fixed on Marcus. The words were casual, but Marcus could hear the underlying judgment in them, the assumption that Marcus had wandered into a place where he didn't belong. Marcus straightened in his seat, forcing his posture to remain composed. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing heart. He didn't want to engage with the officers, he didn't want this moment to escalate. But as Daniel's gaze lingered on him, Marcus knew that it was already too late. "I'm fine, thank you," Marcus replied, his voice even, his hands resting on the table. He did his best to make the words sound casual, to make it clear that there was no reason for the officers to be concerned. Daniels raised an eyebrow, as if he didn't quite believe him. He stepped closer, his boots tapping against the worn floorboards with an almost deliberate rhythm. The younger officer stayed back, watching the exchange with a tense, uncertain expression. "You're sure you're not causing any trouble, are you?" Daniel's tone was mocking now, laced with the kind of condescension that Marcus knew all too well, the kind that suggested that Marcus, despite his accomplishments, was somehow beneath them. "No trouble," Marcus said, maintaining his calm. "Just having a meal." The words were simple, straightforward, but the moment they left his lips, the silence in the room thickened again. The group of men at the counter had stopped talking, now watching with curiosity and barely contained amusement. Diane, the waitress, had stopped moving, her hands frozen mid-air as she looked between the officers and Marcus. For a moment, Marcus thought Daniels might let it go. He might turn away, maybe even apologize for the intrusion. But he didn't. Instead, Daniels took another step closer, his shadow now stretching over Marcus. "Funny," Daniels said, his voice almost conversational. "I don't see many people like you around here. You don't exactly fit the profile for a local." He tilted his head, studying Marcus with a look that was less about curiosity and more about an accusation. An accusation Marcus couldn't quite place. It wasn't a crime to be black. It wasn't a crime to be wealthy or to have risen above the circumstances that had once limited him. But here, in this small town, in this tiny diner, Marcus could feel the sharp sting of systemic prejudice that had been lurking beneath the surface all along. The assumptions about where he belonged, about who he was and what he could achieve, were suddenly louder than ever. The anger surged again, a wave of heat rising in Marcus's chest. He wanted to lash out. He wanted to call Daniels out on his bias, to stand up and scream that he didn't deserve to be treated like this, that he had earned his place here and everywhere else, but instead, he stayed still. He gripped the edge of the table tighter, his knuckles turning white. This was what he had been trained to do. Remain composed, stay above it all. But it wasn't easy. It was never easy. "I'm not causing trouble," Marcus repeated, his voice tight now. "I'm just having a meal, officer." Daniel's gaze hardened, his lips curling into something like a sneer. "A meal?" he repeated, the word dripping with disdain. "We don't often get folks like you in here. You sure you're not lost?" It was the final blow, the moment when the truth hit Marcus. This wasn't just about a small-town cop being suspicious. This wasn't just about a momentary misunderstanding. This was about something much larger. It was about the way the system was designed to keep people like him out, to make sure that no matter how far he had come, no matter how much he had achieved, the world would still see him through the lens of racial bias. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in on him. He could feel the eyes of the group of men, the tension in the air. He could hear their unspoken thoughts, the assumption that he didn't belong here, that he wasn't worthy of being treated like anyone else. But then, something shifted. The younger officer, the one who had been standing in the background, stepped forward. His hand hovered by his holster, and his eyes flickered between Daniel's and Marcus. Uncertainty written all over his face. Maybe we should just let him be," the younger officer muttered, his voice low. Daniels turned sharply to him, his face twisting with irritation. "You don't tell me what to do, rookie," Daniels snapped, his voice cold. The younger officer stepped back, his face reddening as he fell silent. The room held its breath. Marcus could feel the anger rising inside him, but now there was a clarity in his mind, a cold, sharp clarity. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about this moment. This was about something far bigger. This was about the fight he had been silently waging his entire life, a fight that was now reaching its boiling point. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate. He wasn't going to let this moment slip by. Not this time, not when the stakes had become so high. "You'll let me be," Marcus said, his voice steady, his eyes locked with Daniel's. "Or you'll regret it." The atmosphere in the diner was electric, charged with an intensity that seemed to seep into every corner of the room. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Every breath, every movement suspended in the air. Marcus could hear his heartbeat in his ears as he stood, his body rigid, his gaze locked onto Officer Daniels with a quiet defiance. The words he had just spoken, calm but firm, seemed to echo in the space between them. "You'll let me be," Marcus repeated, his voice low, but cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. "Or you'll regret it." For a brief moment, the world felt impossibly still. The room's attention was solely on him now, on the black man in the suit who was standing up to the officer who had, until this point, been allowed to intimidate and belittle. It was clear that Officer Daniels wasn't accustomed to being challenged, least of all in front of others. His eyes narrowed, the lines in his face hardening as he stepped closer to Marcus, his posture rigid and defensive. "Regret?" Daniels sneered, his tone mocking, dismissive. "You really think you can talk to me like that in my town, in my diner?" Marcus stood tall, resisting the instinct to step back, to cower under the weight of the officer's presence. He wasn't afraid. He had faced far worse in his life, but the stakes felt higher now. Something inside him stirred, a quiet resolve that had been building for years, forged by every injustice he had faced, every door that had been slammed in his face because of his race. This was more than just a personal fight. This was about making a stand for everyone who had ever been judged, marginalized, or silenced. Officer Daniels took another step forward, now just a few feet away. The air between them crackled with a growing animosity. "I don't think you understand, buddy," Daniels said, his voice lowering, now laced with menace. "You don't belong here, and I'm starting to think you're here to cause problems. You should have known better than to come in here and make a scene." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he didn't react. His mind was clear now, focused, calculating. This wasn't just about the injustice being done to him in this moment. This was about a systemic problem that was far bigger than this small town, bigger than this diner, even bigger than Officer Daniels. It was about a broken system that had been in place for far too long, one that had continuously sought to hold people like him down. Behind him, Marcus could hear the murmurs of the crowd, the whispers from the men at the counter, their eyes flickering between him and Daniels. The room had gone completely still, waiting for the next move. Diane, the waitress, seemed frozen in place, her hand still gripping the coffee pot, as though she were trying to decide whether to intervene or step away. The younger officer, still lingering at the back, was now shifting his weight uncomfortably, clearly unsure of what to do. He hadn't said much since he first entered the diner, but Marcus could feel his hesitation, the unease in his body language. It was as if the younger officer recognized the injustice unfolding, but wasn't sure how to navigate it. Daniels noticed the younger officer's discomfort. His eyes flicked toward him, and his lip curled in contempt. "You're not gonna do anything, are you?" Daniels snapped, the words loaded with disdain. The younger officer swallowed hard, but didn't respond. That hesitation was all Marcus needed. He could feel the shift in the air, the divide between the old system and the new. He wasn't going to let Daniels or anyone else use fear and intimidation to bend him to their will. Marcus took a step forward, his movements slow but deliberate. "You can keep pretending you have power here," he said, his voice steady. "But this ends now. I'm not your subject. I'm not your prisoner. You can't talk down to me just because you think you're entitled to, and if you lay a hand on me, if you try anything, there will be consequences." Daniel's eyes flicked to the door, as if considering something. For a moment, it felt like he was weighing his options, whether to escalate, to assert his dominance, or to back off. But there was something about Marcus that threw him off balance, something that made him question whether this was a fight he could win. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, the room waiting for someone to break it. And then, from the back of the diner, a voice interrupted. "Everything okay here?" It was Mitchell, the man who had been sitting at the counter, the one with the baseball cap. He was leaning against the counter now, his posture relaxed, but with a visible tension in his eyes. He had been watching the scene unfold, his eyes flickering between Marcus and Officer Daniels. Mitchell had been in the diner long enough to know how things worked here. He had seen Officer Daniels pull similar stunts in the past, had witnessed how easily people like him got away with it. But there was something about the way Marcus was holding himself, about the quiet strength he was exuding, that made Mitchell uneasy. Marcus glanced at Mitchell, then returned his focus to Daniels. "Everything's fine," Marcus said, his voice still calm but firm. He wasn't going to let Daniels intimidate him, not now. "I'm just enjoying my meal." Mitchell, though reluctant, stepped a little closer. "You sure this guy been causing trouble?" He was speaking to Daniels now, his voice tentative, but laced with an undertone of something else, something Marcus hadn't expected. Daniels glared at Mitchell, his face hardening. "No trouble. Just a man who doesn't know his place," he muttered, his eyes never leaving Marcus. "That's all?" Mitchell shook his head slightly, as if he didn't buy Daniels' explanation. His gaze softened as he turned back to Marcus. "I just want to make sure everything's okay, man. You know how it is around here." Marcus could see the conflict in Mitchell's eyes. He wasn't an ally, not in the traditional sense. He was a product of this town, this system. But there was something about him, something that made Marcus think he might understand. For a brief moment, the room felt less hostile. There was an unspoken connection, a glimmer of support that Marcus had been hoping for. But then, as quickly as it appeared, the moment evaporated. Daniels turned toward Mitchell, his expression cold. "You want to make a scene too, Mitchell?" he growled. "You want to stand up for this guy who has no business being here?" Mitchell's shoulders stiffened. For a second, it looked like he might back down, like he was about to retreat into the safety of neutrality. But then, something shifted in his eyes. His mouth tightened, and he straightened up. "I'm just trying to make sure things don't get out of hand," Mitchell said, his voice steady now, but still carrying that hesitant edge. Marcus could see the shift in the room, the subtle way Mitchell was backing him, even if it was only by a fraction. The men at the counter had gone quiet, their eyes flicking between Daniels and Marcus. Diane, still standing at the counter, had stopped moving entirely, her hands frozen in place. The room was waiting for the next move, and it felt like Marcus was standing at the precipice of something much larger than a confrontation in a diner. Officer Daniels took another step toward Marcus, his hand twitching at his belt. Marcus knew that move well. It wasn't just a sign of intimidation, it was a signal that Daniels was prepared to escalate the situation, to make it physical. But Marcus wasn't about to give him that satisfaction. He took one more step forward, closing the gap between them, standing tall despite the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "You don't get to decide who belongs here," Marcus said, his voice now cutting through the tension like a blade. "You don't get to decide who's worth respect, but I'll tell you this. If you try anything, I'll make sure the whole world knows about it." The words hung in the air, heavy with promise. It was no longer just about this small-town diner. It was about taking a stand against everything that had held him back, everything that had tried to silence him. And Marcus Shaw, for the first time in his life, was ready to fight back. Not with fists, but with the strength of his own resolve. The air in the diner had grown thick with tension. The hum of the ceiling fan, the clink of utensils against plates, and the muted murmur of voices had all faded into the background, leaving only the sharp, biting silence that hung between Marcus Shaw and Officer Daniels. Marcus stood his ground, his chest rising and falling with slow, controlled breaths. His heart beat steadily, but every fiber of his being was on alert. He could feel the eyes of the diners on him, and in that moment, it didn't matter how they felt about him. What mattered was this fight for respect, for justice, for the right to stand tall and proud without being reduced to an object of derision. Officer Daniels's eyes were narrowed now, his lips twisted into a tight, contemptuous smile. There was no mistaking the disgust in his gaze, the way he looked at Marcus as though he were some kind of threat, a disruption to the carefully constructed world Daniels inhabited. The officer's hand was still resting on his belt, his fingers twitching, almost as if he were itching for a reason to escalate things. Marcus wasn't going to give him that reason. Not now. Not ever. "You really think you can talk to me like that?" Daniels sneered, his voice lowering, each word dripping with mockery. "You think you can walk in here, with your fancy suit and your self-righteous attitude, and demand respect? You don't belong here, you never did." The words stung, sharper than any blow, but Marcus didn't let it show. He stood tall, unyielding, the weight of Daniel's words slipping off his back like water off a duck's feathers. This wasn't about a suit. This wasn't about how he looked or where he came from. This was about something deeper, something systemic that had been built into the very foundations of this country. Something that was far bigger than just him and Officer Daniels. Marcus had been fighting this fight his whole life. The world had told him, over and over again, that he didn't belong, that he wasn't enough, that his success was a fluke. It had come from his classmates, his co-workers, his neighbors, and yes, his adversaries in power. People like Daniels had spent years trying to uphold a system that kept people like Marcus in their place, that made them feel small. And Marcus had had enough. "Listen to me carefully," Marcus said, his voice low but steady, his words carefully measured. "I don't have to prove anything to you. I don't have to explain myself to you. But you, Officer Daniels, you're not going to intimidate me. You're not going to bully me, or anyone else in this town, anymore." Daniel's eyes flickered with something. Surprise. Maybe he wasn't used to people challenging him like this, especially not in front of a crowd. His face turned crimson as his jaw clenched. "You think you're the only one who's been pushed down by this system?" Daniels barked. "You think you're the only one who's had to struggle? I've seen more injustice in my years on the force than you could possibly imagine. He pointed a finger at Marcus, his voice rising. "You are no better than the rest of them, and the sooner you learn that, the better." Marcus's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just some officer with a chip on his shoulder. This wasn't about one man's bias. This was about something deeper. Daniel's words were telling, a window into the officer's soul, a glimpse of the hatred and ignorance that fueled his every action. It wasn't just about Marcus, it was about a larger, darker truth. Officer Daniels was a part of a system that had been working against people like Marcus for years, a system built on prejudice and corruption. Marcus inhaled deeply, steadying himself as the truth settled like a weight on his shoulders. This moment, this confrontation, wasn't just personal, it was a reckoning. And it was time to expose the man standing before him for what he truly was. "Really?" Marcus said, his voice gaining strength. "You think you're the only one who's struggled? You think you've cornered the market on pain, Officer Daniels? You think you've suffered more than the people you've been hurting your entire career?" Daniels faltered for just a split second, and Marcus seized the moment. The room had gone completely silent. The regulars, the young man at the counter, even Mitchell, everyone watching, waiting for the next move. Marcus wasn't sure where the strength came from, but in that instant, he knew he had to expose Daniels. He had to make sure the room saw the ugly truth. "You think you've had it hard," Marcus continued, his voice carrying across the room. "Try walking through life knowing that every room you enter, every decision you make, every move you take is judged by the color of your skin. Try living in a world that's stacked against you from the very start. People like you, people like Officer Daniels, don't see the struggle you've never had to face the kind of prejudice that I've faced, that we've all faced. You've never had to fight every day just to prove you belong." The words were coming now, flowing like a dam had broken inside of him. He was no longer holding back. He wasn't just speaking for himself. He was speaking for everyone who had been silenced, everyone who had been overlooked, everyone who had been forced to play by a set of rules that were never made for them. Daniels's face twisted in anger, his lips curling into a sneer. "I'm done with this," he growled. With a swift motion, he reached for his belt, and the room held its breath. For a split second, Marcus thought the officer was going to grab his gun, and his heart raced in his chest. But Daniels stopped just short, his hand hovering above his sidearm, as if testing the waters, as if deciding whether he would escalate the situation to violence. That was when Marcus did something he had never done before in a situation like this. He smiled. Not a mocking smile, not a grin of victory, but a calm, knowing smile. "You're scared," Marcus said quietly, his eyes locking with Daniels now. "You're scared because you know that your system is breaking. You know that people like me, people who've been silenced, kept down, beaten down by this system, are standing up. You know that your time is running out, and you know that the moment you try something here, you will lose." Daniels' eyes narrowed, and for a split second, Marcus saw something shift behind the officer's gaze. It was as if the mask had slipped for just a moment, revealing the true nature of the man standing before him. A man who had spent years building his career on fear and control, and who was now faced with a moment of truth. "You really think you're going to change things?" Daniels spat, his voice shaking with fury. "You think you can just waltz in here and turn the world upside down? It's not that simple, Shaw. This is how it's always been. This is how it will always be." For a moment, the room held its breath. Daniels' words hung in the air like a storm cloud, dark and threatening. The young officer shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting toward the door, his hands twitching at his sides. Mitchell stepped back, clearly unsure of what to do. Diane, still frozen behind the counter, glanced between Marcus and Daniels, fear evident in her eyes. And then, in an instant, Marcus made his move. "You think this is how it will always be?" Marcus repeated, his voice rising now, his words cutting through the air with authority. "No, not anymore." Marcus knew he couldn't afford to let Daniels or anyone else like him take control of this moment. The room was on the edge, and if he didn't act now, everything he had fought for, everything he had endured, would slip away. His mind was racing, but his movements were deliberate. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out his phone. With a swift motion, he turned it on, bringing up a live feed of the entire confrontation. "You want to make a scene, Daniels?" Marcus asked, his gaze locking on the officer with a cool, steely intensity. "Let's make it a public one." For a moment, the room went completely still. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for Daniels to react. The weight of the decision was clear. The officer now had a choice. Would he escalate the situation and risk his entire career? Or would he back down, knowing that the eyes of the world would soon be watching? Marcus was ready for whatever came next. The room was frozen in time. Every eye in the diner was on Marcus Shaw and Officer Daniels, the weight of the confrontation between them pressing down on the space like a heavy storm cloud. The rest of the room had gone silent, but the tension was thick, palpable, a charge in the air that made every breath feel like a battle. Marcus stood tall, his back straight, his jaw set in quiet defiance. The words Daniels had thrown at him, the insults, the sneers, none of it was new. he had faced worse. But this moment, this was different. For the first time, Marcus was standing face to face with a man who represented everything he had fought against for his entire life. It wasn't just about Officer Daniels or his disdain. It was about the system, the prejudice, the silent oppressions that had kept people like Marcus in their place for centuries. "I don't know why you're standing there like you're the one in charge," Daniels sneered, his eyes narrowing as they locked onto Marcus. "You don't belong here, and you never will." Marcus's pulse quickened, but he didn't move. Every word Daniels spoke was laced with venom, veiled hatred, bias that ran deep, born from years of unquestioned power. But Marcus wasn't afraid. Not now. He had been underestimated before. Hell, he had been underestimated his entire life. But here, in this moment, he knew that his calm would be the thing that unraveled this officer's illusion of power. "You think you have power over me?" Marcus's voice was calm, but it carried an edge of unshakable resolve. "You don't." Daniel's lips twisted into a smile that could only be described as cruel. "I think I have power over a lot more than you," he growled. "And if you're smart, you'll remember that people like you don't get to walk into places like this and talk down to me." The words hit like a slap. "People like you." It was the same phrase, the same accusation that Marcus had heard throughout his life. The belief that a man like him, black, successful, powerful, didn't belong. Not in places of wealth, not in places of influence, not in rooms where decisions were made. But Marcus had made it to the top of the tech world, and he wasn't about to let this officer, or anyone like him, define his worth. "You don't get to decide where I belong," Marcus said quietly, his voice steady. "And you certainly don't get to treat me like I'm inferior to you." Daniels stepped closer, his eyes burning with anger. "You really think you can stand there and talk to me like that? Like you've got some kind of right to speak up?" His voice was rising, each word heavier with the weight of his disdain. "You think because you've got money, because you've got a fancy job, that you can talk to me like I'm nothing? I'm Officer Daniels, and I don't take disrespect from anyone." The words were like a knife twisting deeper, and Marcus could feel the rage bubbling up, but he swallowed it down. This wasn't about letting Daniels get under his skin. This was about taking control of the situation. He wasn't going to let Daniels drag him into a physical confrontation. He would win this with his words, his strength, his ability to stand firm in the face of injustice. "You're not my superior," Marcus said, his voice gaining strength. "You may wear a badge, but that doesn't make you better than me. It just makes you a part of the system that's been holding people like me back for years. And you know what? I'm done with it. I'm done playing by rules that were never meant for me." Daniel's face turned a shade redder, the veins in his neck bulging as he clenched his fists. "You don't know anything about the system," he snapped. "You think this is just about you and me. This is about order. This is about control. This is about keeping people like you in your place." The words were like a punch to the gut, the full weight of Daniel's prejudice crashing into Marcus. But Marcus wasn't just any man. He was someone who had spent years fighting against systems that were rigged to keep him down. He had built his empire on resilience, on an unwavering belief that his worth wasn't defined by the color of his skin, but by his mind, his character, and his actions. "Keeping people like me in their place?" Marcus repeated, his voice steady but full of fire. "You think you can control me? You think you can control anyone? Not anymore, Daniels. Not now. You're part of a system that's crumbling. People are waking up, and they're tired of being silenced." Daniels's eyes widened for a moment. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected someone like Marcus, someone with so much power, to stand up to him. And that moment, just a flicker of doubt in Daniels's eyes, was the moment Marcus needed. It was the crack in the armor, the opening he had been waiting for. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, his gaze never leaving Daniels. "You may have power in this town, but that power is built on fear. And you know what? I'm not afraid of you." Daniels recoiled, his anger boiling over. "I don't need to be afraid," he spat. "I'm in charge here, and you're just a black man with money, pretending to be something he's not. You'll never be one of them. Not here, not in this town." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, but his resolve only grew stronger. The system, the man standing in front of him, they didn't know what they were up against. They didn't know the fire that had been kindling inside of him for years. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, for everyone who had ever been judged before they had the chance to prove themselves. "I'm not pretending to be something I'm not," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the air. "I am who I am. And you're just a man who's scared of losing his power, scared of a world that doesn't need men like you anymore." The words struck Daniels like a blow. He stood there, frozen, his fists clenched, his face contorted with rage. For the first time, it seemed like Daniels wasn't sure how to respond. His authority, his control, everything he had believed in, was being called into question by a man he had once viewed as insignificant. But Marcus wasn't finished. "You want to make me the enemy? Fine," Marcus said, his voice rising now. "But you're not the one in charge here. You're not the one who decides how this story ends. You've spent your whole life telling people like me that we don't matter, that we're not worthy of respect. But you know what? I'm not backing down. Not anymore." Daniels's lips curled into a sneer. "You're going to regret this," he muttered. "You can't change the way things are. People like you will always be beneath me." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "You don't get it, Daniels. The world is changing. People like me, we're not going anywhere. And soon, people like you will be the ones who have to answer for what you've done." The words hung in the air, the weight of them settling in the room like an anchor. For a brief moment, it seemed like Daniels might snap, might lash out in violence. The tension in the room was so thick that it felt like it might rupture at any moment. And then, just as quickly, something shifted. The young officer, the one who had been standing silently in the background, stepped forward. His hand hovered near his sidearm, but his face was pale, his gaze flicking between Daniels and Marcus. "Officer Daniels?" the young officer began, his voice tentative, unsure. Maybe we should just let this go. This isn't what it looks like. We don't need to escalate this. It's just a misunderstanding." Daniels turned on him with a flash of anger. "Shut up," he barked. "You're not the one in charge here. Stay out of this." The younger officer flinched, his shoulders tensing as he stepped back, unsure of what to do. Marcus saw it, the crack in the foundation of the system. The young officer wasn't so sure anymore. Maybe, just maybe, he had begun to see through the lies that Daniels had built his career on. Marcus's eyes didn't leave Daniels as he took a slow step back, preparing for whatever came next. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time, Marcus felt like he might just win. The silence in the diner was deafening. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if the world had momentarily paused, caught in the aftermath of the confrontation between Marcus Shaw and Officer Daniels. The tension was so thick that it felt like you could cut it with a knife, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone who was witnessing it. And then, the spell was broken. "Officer Daniels!" A calm voice broke the silence. It was the younger officer, the one who had been standing quietly in the background, his voice now filled with hesitation, but an undeniable sense of conviction. I think we need to talk about what just happened." Daniels turned sharply, his face red with fury, but there was something else in his eyes now. Something that had begun to shift after Marcus's words. The officer was still trying to maintain control, trying to salvage his dignity, but it was clear that the ground beneath him was crumbling. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by a flicker of doubt. "What's this?" Daniels spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You gonna side with this man? You really gonna turn your back on the force?" The younger officer's jaw clenched, but his stance grew firmer. "This isn't right, Daniels. I can't keep pretending what you're doing here, the way you've treated him. This isn't what I signed up for." He paused, his gaze shifting between Marcus and Daniels, the weight of his decision settling in. "I'm gonna have to report this." The words hit Daniels like a blow. For a moment, he stood frozen, his mind racing as he processed what had just happened. His own partner, the one he had relied on, was betraying him. The truth was beginning to seep in, and the cracks in Daniels' authority were widening. Daniels began, his voice shaking with rage, but the younger officer raised a hand, stopping him. Don't, I can't cover for you anymore." With that, the younger officer stepped back, his posture still stiff but resolute. Marcus felt a flicker of hope, a sense that perhaps, After all these years, there was something in the system worth fighting for. That perhaps there was a way to chip away at the power structures that had allowed men like Daniels to hold sway for so long, but Daniels wasn't finished yet. He turned to Marcus, his eyes full of fury, but now there was something else, something that suggested the officer was realizing, perhaps for the first time, the consequences of his actions. "You think you've won?" Daniels sneered. "You think the world's going to change because of a speech in a diner? You think the system's just going to fall apart because of you?" Marcus stood his ground, his chest swelling with pride. "No, Daniels, I don't think it's going to fall apart because of me. I think it's falling apart because of people like you. And you know what? The cracks are getting bigger every day." For a moment, Daniels' expression softened, just a fraction. But it wasn't regret or remorse that crossed his face. It was fear. Fear of being exposed, fear of losing the control he had so easily wielded for years. And then, just as quickly as it had started, Daniels turned on his heel and walked out of the diner. No apologies, no attempts to justify his actions. He simply walked away, a defeated man, his power slipping through his fingers. The younger officer watched him leave, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling in his chest. For the first time in his career, he felt like he had made the right choice. As Daniel's car roared to life outside, Marcus stood there, taking in the moment. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew one thing. This moment was a victory. Not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. For everyone who had been told they didn't belong. The other patrons in the diner slowly returned to their meals, their conversation resuming, but there was a noticeable change in the air. A shift had occurred. It wasn't just about one man standing up to another, it was about the seeds of something larger, something that had been quietly growing for years. The way people looked at Marcus had changed, the way they looked at themselves had changed. Mitchell, the man who had stepped forward earlier, took a hesitant step toward Marcus. You did good," he said quietly. "Real good people like him. They think they own everything, but they don't, not anymore." He nodded slowly, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Marcus smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of quiet satisfaction, of knowing that this battle, at least, had been won. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft but steady. "But this isn't just about one man, this is about the system, and it's about time we all start doing something about it." Diane, the waitress, approached Marcus slowly, her movements hesitant but filled with respect. "I don't know what to say, but thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've seen things like this before, people being treated like dirt, and I always just let it go. But tonight, what you did? It was something else." Marcus nodded, a quiet gratitude in his eyes. "You didn't do anything wrong, Diane. It's not your fault. But now, we all have a chance to do something. We all have to stand up." As the night wore on, the room felt different. The diner, which had once been a place of quiet complacency, now felt alive with possibility. The conversation was more thoughtful, the atmosphere less tense. The energy had shifted, and it was clear that the events of the evening had sparked something in the people who had witnessed it. They weren't just bystanders anymore. They were participants in the change that was coming. But even with this victory, Marcus knew the road ahead would be long. The system wasn't going to crumble overnight. There would be more battles, more fights, more moments like this. But now, he felt ready. He felt stronger, more determined than ever. He had faced down an officer who represented everything that was wrong with the world, and he had won. And in doing so, he had ignited something much bigger than himself. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, Marcus took a deep breath, letting the quiet of the evening settle over him. The world outside the diner hadn't changed yet, but something was stirring. There were cracks in the system, and Marcus, along with everyone who had witnessed his stand, was going to make sure those cracks widened. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, there would be challenges. But as Marcus walked into the night, he knew that his fight for justice was far from over. It was just beginning, and that, in itself, was a victory.